All right, so welcome to another edition of iTalks with Amak. Amak is the Archivists and Records Managers Association of Ghana, and iTalk is an informational talk session we have with industry experts. We discuss case studies, best practices, and trending issues. Today, we are really blessed to have a special person in our midst. I followed him for years. He is my mentor, but he doesn't know. I follow him everywhere he goes. Whatever he posts, I make sure I follow, because when I joined AIM first, you were the president. So I kind of followed all the market trend reports, and all those were really insightful for me, because when I got into my company, I was quite young and I had to make immediate impact. And some of those results from your researches gave me data to work with. So it was really cool. He's the former president of the Association for Intelligent Information Management. He is the president of Content Results Limited. Is it limited?
Yep.
Yeah. He's a consultant, yes. And
yes.
Yeah, he's a consultant. And after so many years of serving the association, he left, and he's now giving his services to people who really need help. He is more into the digital transformation space, and more like the artificial intelligence part of the information management, auto classification, auto governance. This is where the industry is going, and he's one of the people who have a lot of good content on that. He's authored and co-authored more than 30 books and ebooks. He's one of the best keynote speakers at most of our AIM events and other events that I haven't attended, but I know there are other events that you are a keynote speaker of. And you wear so many caps, Mr.
Wow,
John.
I'm gonna have to take this and send it to my kids so that they know what their dad's been doing all these years. So thank you very much. That's
Yes.
very kind of you.
So welcome, Mr. John Mancini.
It.
Welcome, and we are privileged to have you. It's your background is quite intriguing, because when I read your profile, you don't really have records management like as your degree or anything. How did you get into the profession or the industry? Tell us your journey.
It's funny. It's a different kind of a journey than I think most people typically have. I guess I was a history and economics major as an undergraduate. So, okay. But it probably didn't really matter, because it was almost kind of it was so long ago. So how I got into this is that basically my career has been in association management, managing associations. And so my first one was with a group called the Public Affairs Council, which was a professional association for corporate public affairs people. And that wasn't really technology centric. But then the next two gigs really were where the technology side came from. And I was with the American Electronics Association and ran the lobbying program for that for US high-tech companies, and did that for about 10 years. And then subsequent to that, took the job as CEO at AIM, and so was there for about 20 years. So it's been a strange combination of both the public policy side and the marketing side. And, along the way picked up at least hopefully a little bit of knowledge about records and information management and things like that.
Yeah. You mentioned something about looking for your grandparents. That led you into the information. Now, tell us a bit about that story.
Oh, well, that's kind of a crazy story. I'm surprised that you follow even that. So that's, I guess, call it my side hustle right now, which is that the short version is that growing up, my father never mentioned his family at all. We just knew they were immigrants from Italy in the 1920s. And we had been told that they had died in the 1930s. And so that was, we had no mention of any family on my father's side. And so as a result of doing some research, we found out that they not only did not die in the 1930s, they actually were both institutionalized in the 1930s, and then they were promptly forgotten for 60 plus years.
Wow.
One wound up dying in 1990, and the other wound up dying in 2002, believe it or not. And so, and unknown to anybody. And so the background, the relationship to records management is that it has me thinking a lot about the question of, okay, 100 years ago, people recorded information in a form such that now we have modern tools that unlock a lot of that. So, previously a lot of that information was locked up because it was analog in nature and hard to understand and hard to search and hard to find and hard to tag and all those kinds of things. But it was preserved in a form such that people could eventually apply those tools. And it's opened up that whole story to me, and it would have been lost forever. And what it has me thinking about is okay, when I look downstream now, how are the decisions that we are making right now with regards to information management and preservation of information? What kind of a foundation are they establishing for people 50, 70, 100 years from now that are going to look back on this era and wonder what on earth we were all up to? And so I guess that the tie back to your original question about professional career and background is that I guess I've always at heart been a history major, and so I'm particularly interested in the role that technology plays in unlocking some of those stories. And so if anybody wants it, it's at searchformygrandparents.com. So thank you for asking.
Cool. Yeah, and you also have a YouTube channel. So if you guys have time, go there. He has rich content. Most of the stuff that he does, he put them there, so you can go and get free content. You don't have to go and hire his services. It's free.
Yeah, it's all free. It's all free.
All right. So we were building ourselves towards the digital transformation apex, where everybody will be moving, and I'm sure organizations and individuals were building themselves towards getting to that point where their organizations will be fully digitalized and they can leverage the richness and the validity of data and how it can be used to make swift business decisions and improve productivity and help organizations to grow exponentially. But 2019, midpoint or end of 2019, then coronavirus hit China. We all thought it was the Chinese thing and it was going to go away, and then it hit the whole world. It was more like a disaster that nobody thought would happen to them, and all of a sudden we were, in everybody was reacting to what coronavirus brought to business and to life. Businesses in particular suffered more because some had to close down. They were not prepared for it. For those who took the early leap into digital transformation, they had already acquired tools and trained their staff. So for them, they could stay afloat. Even though it was quite something to get used to, I'm sure they were a bit prepared to stay afloat until they fine-tuned their systems to meet the new needs. Those who survived it went into all this social media for communication. It's not as if it wasn't there, but it became high on everybody's agenda, using Teams and Google Suits. All these tools came in to be the necessary tools needed to survive the pandemic period. It came in with a new source of information, like repository that you didn't plan for. We had all these structured databases and all that, and all of a sudden you have to go to an easy tool that can help you communicate and work from home. So you just have to survive the period. But in doing that, people have become used to these systems and they might want to continue using them, because you can't invest in such infrastructure and then let it go after COVID.
Right.
People want to continue using that infrastructure. What impact do you think the COVID has had on organizations and the management of information management practices in most of these organizations?
I think there's a couple things, that are. It's really interesting. You ask a good question. It's interesting to think about. We know what we're in the middle of now, but I think the real interesting thing is that in 6 months, when hopefully things start to at least approximate normal again, what is going to be the lasting impact of all of this. And so I think the couple things come to mind as I think about that. One is that, as you mentioned, this has really drawn a sharp line between those that were somewhat prepared for this and those that weren't. And not that anybody could prepare for a worldwide pandemic. I mean, that's unrealistic. But organizations that had prepared for the idea of giving their employees more flexibility in terms of where and how they work, that was a currency that became really valuable as we moved into the COVID times, because there were, in some survey work that I did for AIM, I asked people, how prepared were you for remote work before COVID? And only a third said that they were very prepared, and everybody else was at various levels of unpreparedness. And so first thing I think is that it's put a punctuation point on people that were prepared and people that weren't. And the ones that were prepared had a head start over those that weren't. The second thing I think it's done is that for the ones that were unprepared, it's dramatically accelerated the pace of change just out of necessity. Just what you said, is that in order to keep afloat, people had to do something, because they couldn't just keep operating as they normally did. So it was interesting. I've been in remote work environments for probably most of the last 5 or 6 years, even going back to my AIM times.
Oh, okay.
And so it didn't really strike me as anything terribly different, although I can't go to Starbucks anymore, and I can't go, meet somebody for lunch anymore and things like that. But the work environment of working remotely is something that I'm really familiar with. But for a lot of organizations, what it did is it took all those objections that people used to have for that sort of thing. Oh, we can't do it now, or can we trust our employees to really work, while they're at home, and people had to jump on that bandwagon. And so it's taken, I think, probably 2 or 3 or 4 years worth of, transformation, and, forced it down into a 9-month period and accelerated that. And so I think that's been productive. And then the third thing, I think, as I think about this, is that, a lot of that has been done under some sense of urgency, and it's been done under some sense of, we are just going to have to do whatever it takes in order to get by. But there's a subsequent thing that has to happen now, which is that you're going to have an awful lot of organizations that are thinking, okay, well, where do we go now in terms of our remote work practices? What stays, what goes, what do we keep, what do we get rid of? That's a big thing. But then also a really big thing is, what does this all say about the information that's been accrued during the COVID period? How are we going to manage this moving forward? How are we going to manage the systems that we put in place in order to deal with COVID? You've been around long enough, you can remember everybody having SharePoint sprawl back in the, 2010. Nobody had project management software. So then all of a sudden, people were like, hey, this SharePoint thing, that could be a pretty good way of doing this. And nobody gave any thought to how they were going to manage that. And so it just grew like crazy. And then people spent millions of dollars trying to put that genie in the bottle, after the fact. And I think we're going to have a fair amount of that going forward, that all of a sudden people are going to realize, this is information that needs to be managed, and we didn't really give that any thought when we turned on all these systems out of a sense of emergency. So it's going to be very interesting to watch how organizations try to figure out that in the next couple of years.
Yeah, that's interesting, because some had legacy systems that they were still using, and you might have made a business case like, you guys need to upgrade, or you need to get a new one, and they were like, oh, give us some years, and all of a sudden they are in a hurry to do it. And that might also cause problems, because they might not pay attention to the little things that they need to pay attention to, because they are in a reactionary stage, and all they do is, let's just get a system running. They might activate certain features that don't need to be activated. They might be paying extra for things they don't need. And at the end of the pandemic, either they go like, this is too expensive for us, or this is good, but how do we refine this to meet our core business needs?
Right.
What advice would you give to the information management professional who is in an organization, and there's an expectation that they would give good advice to the organization as to what to do now with the systems they have, or should the potential of they looking at new systems that would help them meet their organizational goals, especially in the middle of the pandemic? Let's not look at post. In the middle of it, people are going through that decision-making process now, and they don't know whether they should stay with their legacy system and upgrade, or they should go to a new system that is easy for everyone to use.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting. The first thing I'd say in terms of advice to people that are trying to help their organizations build up this kind of capability is don't waste a good crisis, because all of a sudden, some of the things that we've all been talking about in this space for many years, and you try to convince C-level people that this is all important, all of a sudden they're realizing that how we manage information, no matter where the people are, no matter what the device they're working on, no matter what the circumstances of work, how do we manage that in a secure and private way is important to us. And so they don't really quite realize, I think, sometimes at the C-level what that means, but they're perhaps listening more closely than they once were. And so we have an opportunity to try to fill in that void and fill in that vacuum as information professionals, I think. The second thing is, I'd say, look at what you currently have right now and see if there are capabilities that you can leverage more effectively than maybe you have in the past. So one example, not a product endorsement, but just an example, everybody has Office 365 in some way, shape, or form in their organization. Often they did it as a result of trying to find an alternative to premise-based email. And so they implemented it in order to replace Exchange. But they have the suite there in their organization. So I think what I've seen a lot of organizations do is that as they struggle with this question of remote work, all of a sudden they look around and they think, well, this Teams thing that we've had, we could maybe use that for something. And so Microsoft has seen the number of Teams implementations, average daily users, go from about 25 million a year ago to almost 200 million now. And so it's a dramatic explosion. And so that's an opportunity, because it's part of a platform that has a lot of different capabilities that people have been trying to get for a long time, but they always get it from little bits and pieces here and there from different solutions. But if you want to do chat, you want to do video, you want to do documents, you want to, all those different things are all in that platform. But that raises the third point, which is that there's both a challenge and an opportunity there. The opportunity is that you have a lot of people on a common platform that can do a lot of different things. That's great. That's also the challenge too, because every time people use the Teams platform, they're also creating documents in SharePoint, they're creating documents in OneDrive, they're creating chats that have to be managed, all sorts of different pockets of content creation that they haven't even really thought about. Because all they've been figuring out is how to get a video tool on the desk of all my people so that they can work. But now they have to reconcile that. Now they have to think about that. And I guess one thing that I hope happens, but I don't know if I'm 100% sure that it will happen, to be honest, is that people will realize, okay, I've got this common framework that if I put governance parameters around that framework, I can at least address 80% of my information management and governance challenges through a common platform. But whether people will do that or not, it remains to be seen.
Because I'm seeing a challenge with something like auto classification and auto governance. when you're using the mobile and the systems at the same time. So some of the users are largely on mobile because like engineers might be on the field and all they do is they approve stuff on their phone by proxy to the system in the organization. The different systems, does it affect governance and the auto classification thing? Do you have to do any special settings or buy any special tool to be able to get a mobile to be able to govern the records that people make on their phones, aside the records that people generate on their computers in the office? Because some people are hybrid, they use the on-premises, and then most of those who use the phones are using the cloud services. When you
it depends in many ways on the underlying platforms, I think, that you're using. So for example, if folks are operating within an M365 platform, and it doesn't really matter so much whether they are operating on a phone or on a laptop or on a standalone PC or whatever, it all has a common framework associated with how information is governed. Now, whether people have set it up properly, whether people have activated it and linked it to their business strategy properly, that's where a lot of the hard work comes from. I do a lot of work with a consulting firm called Infotection.com, and they really focus on that question of, you have business strategy, you have information strategy, and you have your M365 strategy. How do those pieces fit together? And how do you get them working in concert with each other? And there's a lot of capability there that hasn't been turned on in many organizations, mainly because they got a little cynical as a result of some failed experiments maybe back in 2010 with SharePoint records management, and they don't quite believe that they can do it. And so, but there is capability there that didn't exist 10 years ago. That's worth exploring. But I think your point about maybe at the heart of some of this, when we talk about auto classification, for example, I think one of the things that organizations have to come to grips with is that the volume of information is rising quicker than our ability to assimilate that information using traditional means. And so that has enormous implications for risk, enormous implications for processes, enormous implications for how you derive value from that information. And so, some work that I've done with some AIM surveys, I've asked this question over and over again to senior people in organizations over the last year. I ask them two questions. One is, I say, okay, if the volume of information coming into your organization now is X, what do you think it's going to be in 2 to 3 years? And I've gotten like 1,000 people commenting on this question. And it almost always comes back somewhere between 3.5x and 4.5x. And so that is a huge growth in a short period of time. But it gets even more complicated than that, which is that I ask a second question, as I said, okay, what percentage of that do you think is data? And what percentage do you think is unstructured information? Things like documents and invoices and pictures and videos and chat files and all sorts of things like that. And that answer usually comes back between 55 and 60%. So you put those two together, huge volume, huge variety. You can't manage that moving forward in the same way that you always did it, which brings you to auto classification and really investigating what it means to try to automatically categorize information and tag information and set up retention for information as it comes into the organization, rather than thinking that, that's something I'll get to someday. And that's a big leap for many organizations to think in those terms.
So what advice would you give to organizations and the information management professional if they have plans to embark on this project of getting a tool or a system that can help them auto-classify? Where should they start from?
I think it starts maybe with asking the right questions about information. And my friend Brian Tumler, who a lot of the AIM people know, I've done a lot of work with Brian for oh gosh, for 20 years now. But he has an interesting series recently that he posted in which he says you ought to ask 3 questions, when you start auto classification and when you start to think about how you determine where you put your effort. And so he says, when you think about information, ask these 3 questions about it. First of all, what is it? So in other words, when you look at these vast troves of information, are they invoices? Are they proposals? Are they documents? Are they contracts? What are they? Is the first thing that you have to understand about them, and use tools to help you do that sorting in a more automated fashion rather than a manual fashion. Then the second question you have to ask in order to prioritize is, what context does all that stuff occur? So, for example, if does it occur in you could search, for example, on the word invoice, in amongst all sorts of information that you have. But just because it has invoice in the words on the page doesn't necessarily mean that it is an invoice.
Yeah.
It could be a letter about an invoice. It could be a credit card receipt about an invoice. It could be an invoice. It could be all sorts of different things. So you have to understand the context of the information and figure out not only what it is, but what it means. And that's kind of the second thing. And then the third thing, which I think is important, which people don't often do, is that you have to start someplace. And so I think the third question is, does this information represent a source of risk and or value? In which case, then we ought to bump it up and do it first, because you can't do everything all at once. Yeah. And so, what is it? What's its context? And is it a source of risk and or value? Ask those 3 questions before you start an auto class project, because that'll sort of help you figure out where you go first.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now that's very good information. I'm sure people are taking notes. Yeah. So with the information management professional, what should they do now with all these new tools coming up? First of all, you don't know what your organization is going to go for. So you don't know where to learn. For me, I just go online. I'm like, what courses can I take now to prepare myself for anything that comes up? And there's so many tools now. There are a lot of them. We know that Microsoft is taking a chunk of the market because most organizations use Microsoft Suite, Office Suite. So Teams and all these things come in easy for them. Office 365 and all that. But there are other tools that are also, making their claim in the market, and they are doing well. Where should the professional start? Should they sell the idea to the organization before they train themselves, or they should start training in certain areas before they get their businesses involved in thinking of moving in that direction?
Yeah, it would be nice to say, start with one, then do the other. But probably the reality is that you almost have to do kind of both in parallel a bit. Yeah. So I think, mainly because things are just moving so quickly right now, is that I used to joke that it would, in some of the internal systems that we had at AIM, it would be great to put up a sign and say, closed for renovation, and and reopen in 6 months, and get all the systems the way you wanted them to go. Mm-hmm. But that's not the reality for most organizations. When they deal with their information management systems, it's somewhat like trying to change a light bulb while the power is still on. You have to be very careful about how you go about this. So I think when you look at how do you prioritize immediate efforts, it's, where's the greatest short-term bang that you can have? Because a lot of organizations are in a short-term crisis right now that's been driven by COVID and a dramatic change in the conditions and nature of work. And so figure out those short-term things. Longer-term things, I think you have to get yourself trained up for the future. And a lot of that depends, where you go depends on where you start. Mm-hmm. If you're a records management person who is rooted in a lot of manually based processes, you got to figure out how you get knowledgeable about how technology can be applied to those policies, because they're not going to be implemented in the same way as they traditionally were. And so it's not that those skills are irrelevant. They just need to be matched to the technology capabilities. I spent a lot of time at AIM trying to encourage people to take the CIP, the Certified Information Professional.
Yeah.
I think it's a valuable certification. I will say that I think when I look back on my time at AIM, one of my frustrations was that we never got that to scale as rapidly as we hoped it would. I hope they still can scale it, because I think that fundamental grounding in principles that surround information, independent of vendor, independent of immediate challenge, just fundamental principles about capture, about management, about preservation, about records. Those fundamental principles need to be in place so that you can adapt and look at some of the tools in a more systematic kind of way. And so, whether it's the AIM, I like the AIM CIP, ARMA has an IGP certification, whatever it is, you have to invest in yourself these days, because you won't be able to keep up. And the third thing, I guess, is that, everybody has virtual events right now, some free, some for pay.
Yeah.
Take advantage of that.
Yeah.
It's there's a lot of rich opportunity. I know AIM's event is virtual. I think ARMA's is virtual. The MER, Managing Electronic Records event, in May is virtual. It's a very good event. There's a lot of opportunities now that are going to be cheaper and they're not as much fun as hopping in an airplane and going to a hotel and having drinks in the lobby and having dinner with friends and all that stuff. So for your company's perspective, it's actually a much better expenditure, because they're not paying for any of that now. But so take advantage of that while it lasts.
Cool. So you talk about CIP. When I was writing my exam, I was like, I didn't know that AIM made such a great effort in getting this body of knowledge together for the professionals, because in as much as it is a certification exam, it is a practical guide to doing your work. I was so impressed with it. Like around the same time I was writing my CIP, I was running a SharePoint implementation project, and there's a topic in the CIP, it's like implementation of information systems or something, implementing information systems. And it takes you through building your business case, getting approval, doing the business analysis, and going through all that to setting up the system and implementing and testing. And I'm like, this is something that you might not learn in the classroom. I didn't learn that in my master's degree class. But I did a master's in information studies, but I didn't get that. So I'm like, it's a very resourceful tool. And if anyone is watching, I would I have tried it. It's working for me. Currently, I still use that body of knowledge, the book, to address certain issues that come up. And it's very relevant. It's current. Most of the issues, I think there's a 2019 version now.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, no, it's really, I'm glad to hear you say that. And it's really interesting, because I think when we created it, we never intended it to be a replacement for a master's degree in information sciences, or a replacement for a degree in library sciences or anything like that. But what we wanted to do two things. One is for people that had that background, we wanted to also give them a tool that was easy to access and not that expensive, that might put a practical layer on top of the educational based learning that they had done.
Yeah.
And that was kind of one thing that we wanted to do. And then the other thing we wanted to do is for people that weren't necessarily as deep in their knowledge as somebody that had educational background in this, is give them a framework to think about what they do with regards to the handling of information assets that was broader than just their immediate job. And so that they could kind of think about it a little more holistically. And, Atlas Sheckland, who's at infotection.com now, he kind of created that, working with Jesse Wilkins, who's still on the AIM staff.
Yeah.
And, together, I think I would agree with you. I think the most impressive thing, I think, of that whole thing is that body of knowledge.
Yeah.
And you look at that and you think, just assembling that is really something. And, my hope would be that it gets much wider distribution maybe than it has in the past.
Yeah, I'm hoping so. I whenever I have the opportunity, I inform my friends and colleagues that they need to look at it, because it's something that you can't buy in the market. These CIPs take their time and they bring their practical experiences on the board, and they advise what should go into the content, and that has become like the value that we get from being a part of the association. I'm not selling AIM, but that is the truth.
No, nor am I. I don't work there anymore. But I think the one thing that somebody told me at one point, and I think it's really true, is that everybody wants to automate things now, but you can't automate unless you have a solid foundation and unless you have a solid architecture to support that foundation.
Yeah.
And so, it used to be almost that people would just deploy, and then think about how the pieces fit together later.
Yeah.
Now you've really got to think about those pieces like Lego blocks, that fit together on top of each other.
Yeah.
And that also link back to your business strategy, because if you don't do that, then nobody's going to care and you won't get funding for your projects. So, so from business strategy to information strategy, and to think about that in a holistic way so that the projects that you have make sense, and that they aggregate, and 1 + 1 winds up adding up to 3, rather than, unfortunately, a lot of IT projects in the past, 1 + 1 winds up adding up to 1.5, which is not where you want to be.
Well, that's a good one there. But the question is, what tools now? I mean, I know there are lots, but you are a consultant. You've come across a lot, and those that are really upskilled up there, that's optimal for efficiency. What tools would you recommend for the professional?
I think in terms of, I think the thing that organizations need to do is think in terms of platforms and not products. So, it's a real temptation to deploy a product to solve a particular burning pain that you have in the organization that you have to address. But you have to think about it, I think, a little differently in a cloud era, which is, what's happening with the cloud is that the pace of innovation accelerates dramatically. I mean, just look at M365, for example, and think about, you have a lot of experience with SharePoint. I mean, think what it was like when, it used to be MOS in 2007, and then the 2010 version of SharePoint, and then 2013 version, and then 2016.
Yeah.
And then you had 3 years in between. And everybody would always be pretty comfortable with the fact, I remember asking this at AIM meetings, no matter what version it was that we were doing a road show or a seminar on, I'd say, the current version of SharePoint is X, and which version are most of you all on? And it almost always was X-1 and a significant tail of X-2 and X-3.
Yeah.
And that was a luxury in terms of pace that organizations had that they don't have anymore, because the pace of change that's going on within the M365 platform on the cloud is, it's a daily rate of change. It's when I talk to people, one of the things they say, it's incredibly hard just to keep up on what's going on.
It's true. Yeah.
With that platform. And it's not just M365, it's going on with all the cloud platforms. But the point is that I don't think you can keep up if you have a product mentality. You have to have a platform mentality. And so you have to say, okay, it's our best bet right now that over the next 2 or 3 years, we're going to try to push as much as possible into this particular platform. And we're going to go along for the ride, the innovation ride with that platform, and see where it goes. And understand that that's not going to solve 100% of your problems, but in a rapidly changing time, you can never solve 100% of your problems. If you can solve 70 or 80%, you're way ahead of the pack, because the pace of change is going to be so dramatic, and there there's going to be a whole lot of people still back in on-premise world that are going to have an awful hard time keeping up.
That's true. That's true. So people are going to struggle with, first of all, people are creating a lot of video content. And the question would be, should I go for a DAM, like a digital asset management tool? Or should I go for a tool that can just keep the videos and images for some time and then I'll delete them when I don't need them? Because I'm realizing from working from home now that we do more video calls and most of them are recorded, and it's going to create more records than needed. Without a digital asset management tool, how easy is it to manage these video records?
Well, and I think, video records are probably more complex than some, just because of they're so freaking big, and also because often in video and audio contexts, people tend to be more informal than if they're in if they're a formal document setting, which then opens up the opportunity for people sometimes saying things that they might not necessarily put on paper or put on electrons. And so I think it comes back to some of those same questions that Brian Tumler, raised originally, is like, okay, what's the video about? Who is creating it? What is the context for that video? Does it have long-term implications for the organization? Does it carry, are you talking about subjects that carry risk associated with it? And then from a knowledge management perspective, which ones really have value in terms of exerting some sort of an effort to make sure that they can be preserved or repurposed for something else? And those are not an easy set of questions, because obviously having a quick 10-minute video talking about some inconsequential item is probably something that you're not going to hang on to, for a long period of time. But on the other hand, if you're having a video conversation about something that's pretty fundamental to either the company or to a product or to some service that you're thinking about offering, you probably do want to preserve that for some length of time. And so you got to think through what you used in order to keep that stuff secure.
Yeah, so some people are now torn between going to the cloud or being on premise. And that the best advice is, that's what I have read, to do a hybrid. But for some organizations, they're quite skeptical about the security in the cloud. So they go like, it's cheaper to go cloud if we have all these digital assets. The cloud has a lot of space, it can keep them, and as and when we want, we delete them. But when it's on premises, you are going to have this physical servers that are going to suffer the burden of the weight of these documents.
Yep.
Would you advise? I wouldn't ask it that way. Like, what is the best way to go? The cloud has its issues, but is it like, compared to on-premise, is it like 80% safe with security?
I guess the way I would usually answer that is I think, okay, who do you think is going to do a better job of security? Is it going to ultimately be Amazon or Google or Microsoft or somebody whose entire future rests on the security of that platform? Or is it going to be a bunch of people dealing with servers in the back room of your organization, in which everybody knows that the password to the little lock that's on the computer room is 987654321, because it's also functioning as a storage room because people have stuff in there? And that's an extreme case. But what I'm saying is that I think risk is relative. And what winds up happening, I think, is that people feel more comfortable with the idea of something that they can kind of put their arms around and control, that's right there in front of them. But that might not be a realistic assessment of risk when it comes to protecting that information long term. It's kind of like, I remember years ago, dates me, but back before, my wife used to do a lot of online purchases. She she was very skeptical about, using the credit card online.
Yeah.
And I'd say okay, so let me understand this. So you're perfectly comfortable with going into a restaurant, handing a 16-year-old your credit card, having them disappear for 15 minutes while they run it through a machine in the back room, come back and hand you the credit card. That makes me more comfortable than ordering online. And it took a while, and there were a lot of people that's how everybody felt at the time. And of course, right now, that's all we do. I mean, and so there was an inflection and a change that took place there over the course of 5, 6, 8, 10 years. And I think the same thing's going on in the cloud right now. If I go back and look at old AIM surveys from 6 or 7 or 8 years ago and ask people about the cloud, people were saying, no way, there's no way I'm using it. Yeah. And that's not the answer you get now.
True. So in Africa, I wouldn't say all of the African countries because I don't know much about what they do, but in Ghana in particular, most of the organizations that I know, and I'm using this carefully, most of the organizations I know, not right. all the organizations, they're kind of skeptical about it, the cloud. Even if they do use it, they use it for just a minimal amount of their processes. And with the COVID coming in, people have to work from home, people have to work offsite, and they would have to get access to these files and documents in the cloud. Your company is still not opening up to the idea of you going to cloud technology. How can you go around this to convince your management that you need to do this?
I think it's a question. Again, it goes back to that platform conversation that we had earlier. Is that if you look ahead 5 years from now, or even 3 years from now, do you think that the bulk of your information is going to be on a cloud platform, or is it going to be on an on-prem platform? And I think in order to keep pace with innovation, it's got to be on a cloud platform. And so then the question becomes, okay, if that's the case, and that's not 100% of information, don't get me wrong, there are cases in which you want to go with on-prem for different things, but the bulk of your information, where's it going to be and how are you going to manage it? And there are a lot of variations of the cloud. There's public clouds and private clouds and semi-private clouds. There's all sorts of variations, but it's the concept, I think, that's important. I think you have to conclude that you have to head in that direction, and as much as possible, shift stuff to cloud-based environments, because otherwise you're not going to be able to keep pace.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I guess maybe you have to find some case studies that have worked for similar organizations.
Yep.
Yeah, and then let them know the threats of not doing it, or the potential hazard that could be caused if that is not done sooner. Because this is Corona, we don't know what is coming next. So,
and whatever it is, and pendulums tend to swing widely in the short term and not so widely in the long term. So, in the short term, we've gone from a lot of people that said no way am I going to have people working, at home. What are you kidding me? We're not going down that path. That might be fine for some of those crazy technology companies in Silicon Valley, but we're not doing that. All of a sudden, COVID hits, comes way over here, and and everybody's working at home.
Yeah.
And so once the COVID pressure goes away, I think the question becomes, does it whip back to here? Or does it wind up someplace like over here in the middle? And I think it's going to wind up someplace over there in the middle. And I don't think work's going to be the same after COVID as it was before COVID. But it's not going to be the same as it was during COVID, if that kind of makes sense.
Yeah. So what would you advise now going forward, disaster planning? What should the records or information management professional look up to when they are planning for a disaster? Because nobody thought this would come, but anything can happen. Do we have to invest more in scenario planning? And what do you
think
advise?
There's a certain amount of that you have to do. I don't know that anybody had 2020 pandemic on,
Yeah.
on their scenario bingo card,
Yeah.
back in 2018 and 19 when they were planning systems. I think what would have been realistic to have on your card at that point would have been growing pressures from employees for more flexibility in the nature and circumstance of how and where they work. And that would have been something I think that organizations should have included into their scenario planning moving forward, which would have been helpful in the COVID environment. And so I don't think you can, there's so much craziness that goes on in the world. Who knows, the specifics of what happens next. But I think some of the more generic changes that are going on, things like, people are going to want more flexibility in the circumstances of their work. I think everybody knows that. I think everybody understands that. I think, privacy that's dictated by setting up higher and higher walls at the perimeter is not going to work anymore, as information gets more distributed. Those kinds of things, I think, are things that can be incorporated into people's plans.
Okay. So my last question, final one. What is the future for information management professionals? So I have these group of students who kind of ask me, I'm doing records management, I'm reading information studies, I don't know what I'm going to do with this. Does it even have potential? What do you have for the upcoming information management professionals? What's the future?
I think there's really there's two ways of answering that. I think, the first is that, okay, if in an environment in which more and more value is delivered through digital mechanisms, the people that understand that and can communicate that and can help companies reposition themselves against that value proposition have enormous value for their organizations. That's kind of point one. Point two, I think, is a lot harder, is that in order to be effective in that role, you have to understand that you have to speak a lot of different dialects in your organization. So, when you're talking to IT, it's, you've got to, that's one dialect. When you're talking to legal, that's another dialect. When you're talking to some line of business person that has, process things that he's worried about, when you're talking to a marketing person that is thinking about customers, when you're talking about C-level, so that question of dialect becomes really important. Frankly, not something Americans are good at, but that's another whole question. And so that question of making sure you understand the audience that you're talking to and fashioning what in terms of information management techniques and approaches and strategies, refashioning that in the language that they speak. That, I think, is the key skill moving forward. That's in large part what the CIP is about, but that's really, I think, key.
Yeah, I think that is what will make you stand out, because when they know that you understand their processes and you're able to liaise with them on common projects, then they value what you do. And then, but I would add that for most of the young people coming, everybody creates records or information every day on a daily. It's like we create millions of records every day. Who is going to manage it? If not you. So there's a huge potential for you, the young guys who are coming up. Just get the right mentors, get the right training, and you'll be good out there. It's amazing to have you today. This was one of my dreams. I'm like, I hope one day I'll be able to interview or have an informational interview with John Mancini. I know it was so fun. No, you're very busy. You're very, very busy.
We'll do it again.
Yeah, I'm very happy.
You have to give me 6 months though, so I can think of new things to say. So.
Okay, all right, I'll do that. And we would look forward to having you maybe on a webinar with all the association members, because I'm sure most of them know you, and it would be nice to meet you. Yeah.
Great.
Okay.
Thank
you. All right. Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.